The topic of this report was done with a little bit of controversy. People used to think of freedom of expression related only to media and journalists in general. And interestingly enough, when I came into the mandate, I made the purpose of looking at freedom of expression from the broadest possible perspective. I come from a very small country, but with a very strong cultural diversity. In Guatemala, we have, besides Spanish as a common language, we have 22 different Mayan languages and a strong ethnic sort of culture of the Mayan population, ancestral Mayan population of the country. And of course, we have been suffering discrimination and hate speech for a long time. So for me, that was a very important topic. But also the defense of cultural diversity and cultural expressions as one of the richest elements of the world in forms of freedom of expression. And there were reports like hate speech that was very difficult because you want to focus on the positive and not on the negative. But again, this was a result of what was the debate in the world at the moment. This was after the tragic events in Oslo, and it was very important, and actually there was very big interest in Norway, but around the world to handle tragic issues like that. How can xenophobia or speech of that nature generate such levels of violence, and how can states deal with the prevention? And as a matter of fact, after my report, the High Commissioner followed it up with the Rabat Plan of Action, which was a consultation around the world, an official consultation by the High Commissioner with states. So I was able to participate in both. But the most important aspect, I think, was a procedural aspect. I was able to deal with these topics by holding regional consultations. And every single report I did from 2010, from the Internet Freedom of Expression reports, were also part of the dialogue. I couldn't say were the result of the consultations because not necessarily everything in the consultations was used, but it gave me the feeling of what was happening in the world. What was important was to break away from the four walls of the Palais de Nation and leave Geneva and go out to the world. So we, in this report, for instance, on electoral communication, we had a Southeast consultation in Bangkok, we had an African consultation in Johannesburg, we had a European consultation in Madrid, we had a Latin American consultation in Rio de Janeiro, and we had a couple of technical meetings of experts, one in Washington, one in Central America, with Central America and Mexico, just a small group of experts coming together. And it was very clear for me that the time was right, because of all the prior consultations, everyone was beginning to talk about elections and communication and transparency. Let me say just two words about the report and also what we're working on for the next report, which I will not present myself, but I leave a draft for my successor. The idea of this report was to draw on the two aspects, the two dimensions of freedom of expression. But the most important one, obviously, was the pluralism and diversity, exactly what we're looking at here. Why? Because in reality, what we're talking about, and I always say this, is when we're defending freedom of expression, we're also defending democracy. Only a truly democratic society can guarantee fully freedom of expression. Authoritarian regimes tend not to like people to speak out, or to have diverse opinions, or to be able to criticize public policies or public officials. So democracy and freedom of expression go hand in hand, and this is why the link is very easy. My report is not on elections or electoral systems. My report is on communication and freedom of expression, but linked to that. So the first element I propose is that some issues that we defend all the time become even more relevant in an electoral period. The principle of diversity and plurality that UNESCO established many years ago is valid all the time to guarantee full information and access to information to society, but also to guarantee freedom of expression of all sectors with a pluralism of ideas and opinions. But in elections, they are particularly important because elections have to be pluralistic in order to be truly democratic. So it has a double meaning. And in that sense, first, we must guarantee diversity of media, which means we can have commercial media, we can have community media. We can have, I added a fourth, ethnic media, understanding that of specific media of minorities, especially in broadcasting. And the fourth is public media, as long as it's independent public media, not controlled by any party or any particular government. And it is the balance of all the forms of communication, from the local community forms of communication to the national networks of television or radio, or now to the use of internet. I must say, and this is interesting, that although I have written a lot about internet and freedom of expression and about the defense of universality of the use of the internet and the need to defend the human rights focus and the diversity that we should have in internet, and also the neutrality of internet, it is still true, and this I confirmed in every single continent of the world, that national elections are not determined by internet yet. The strongest case for internet was probably in the US, was the elections of Obama, who had a very important role with internet. But in the rest of the world, the percentage is 80% of the population still makes their decisions based on television coverage, not even radio or written press. So ironically, although we're in the beginnings of the massive use of the new technology, television is still the most important controlling aspect of communication in elections. That doesn't mean it applies to all other topics. So it's true to me that in telecommunications, in broadcasting, and television and radios, where there should be a particular emphasis on diversity, plurality, and given the fact that the state owns the frequencies, it's a big opportunity for states to assume the responsibility on using those frequencies responsibly and wisely, and how they are allocated and distributed. And also, I put it in my report, in having regulatory bodies, telecommunication regulatory bodies that are truly and absolutely independent. They are technical bodies, but independent from governments in general. So that was the first aspect of my report, is to re-emphasize. We also run into traditional problems that we have, and I pointed there in freedom of expression that constitute, in some cases, the misuse of expression or legitimate limitations. And one of them is hate speech. And I point out to the cases of two forms of speech which are particularly relevant in elections. One is the homophobic speech, and we had 2 or 3 cases. Uganda was probably one of the worst scenarios on homophobic speech, where, interestingly enough, there were candidates making campaign speeches based on incitement to violence against LGBT population and harassment and attacks on LGBT population, and trying to define their, we would say in Spanish, machismo, their male sort of dominance and capacity to lead the country based on their attack on LGBT population. This is absolutely unacceptable. You cannot build a campaign, which should be a democratic campaign, on the exercise of hatred against a particular sector of the population, and specifically incitement to hostility and violence to this sector. I mentioned Uganda because it's one of the worst cases, but it happens everywhere, including Russia these days, where there's even legislation in terms of education and sexuality. And the second aspect of hate speech was the xenophobia against migrants. This is truly serious. In Europe, obviously you all have seen this happening, but I must confess that it's happening everywhere. The fear of foreigners, of people that are different, just because they have a different language, they come from a different region, because they're competing for jobs at a lower salary around the world due to the economic crisis, is provoking that many sort of very hardline parties are campaigning with the slogans that we will get rid of all the foreigners, we will push the foreigners out, we will use violence against the foreigners, we will detain the foreigners and treat them as criminals. They never say it exactly in those words, but this is the message. So we have a dehumanizing form of speech. I say in my report that it's absolutely legitimate that every nation have a migratory policy and immigration laws that should be kept. I understand that perfectly well. But this doesn't mean that we can dehumanize the treatment of anyone. Even migratory laws have to treat migrants with decency and with respect, and especially with respect to their human rights. They're not criminals, they're not They're not terrorists, they're not attacking a nation. They have to be seen as individuals who will be processed in an administrative way, not in a criminal way, not jailed because they trespassed a border or frontier. So this was the other aspect of incitement to violence being used with electoral purposes, and I must say tragically used very successfully, because we see a lot of hardline political parties gaining momentum and gaining positions on the basis of this sort of strong anti-human speeches and provocation and incitement to hostility against other human groups. These were like I said, the traditional aspects. And the second big traditional aspect of freedom of expression, which should be highlighted in electoral communication, is the protection of journalists. I have written reports. My report to the council last year was on the need to protect journalists, not only because of the defense of their freedom of expression, but it's also especially for the defense of the right to access information that society has. And the access to information of society will depend on a free press and a pluralistic press. And this is, again, we go back to pluralism. So defending the press has a legal part of it, to defend pluralism, to allow all forms of expression, to allow all forms of media, but it has a physical element and a physical responsibility, because violence increases during electoral periods. There is an aggressiveness against the press, and many political parties or political leaders, especially those parties that have more of a fundamentalist religious connotation or a fundamentalist political position, tend to be very aggressive against the press that is critical of their positions. And oftentimes, journalists run a risk by covering the electoral process. So we said, having full information of candidates, platforms, promises, the biographies of those competing for power, or any other information, is only guaranteed if full access and secure access is guaranteed to journalists. This is a key topic. Again, I insist, this is a permanent topic for all states. Permanently, journalists should be protected. We had a couple of side events in Geneva this week on that, promoted by Austria, that and there was the question whether journalists have more rights than others, and the response was no. Journalists have exactly the same rights as any other person, but what we're protecting here is the function of journalists. That the protection of the press, to have a free press, is a guarantee for society of being informed. The same way that the protection for human rights defenders is not because they are a different type of individual with more rights, but it's because of the function of promoting and defending human rights, which is crucial for any society. So this element was left very clear there as well. Now, what were the crucial recommendations which were new in this report? Number one is the question of transparency. First, I discovered that this deals with access to information, was part of the mandate report. The transparency, obviously, should be on the funding of campaigns. And this is something I found enormous preoccupation around the world, from Africa to Thailand to the US, for instance, because there's a deregulation process in the US. Many NGOs are looking at the fact that the deregulation should not mean, probably against deregulation, but should not mean necessarily anonymity of donations to campaign, because that becomes very dangerous. In societies of Central America, like my own, and I can say this freely because it's my own country, so I'm free to criticize it, we have a serious problem by the penetration of organized crime into the political life. So, and this is so absurd that it's even mentioned in the press. It's the common gossip. We have a candidate, which today, by the way, is the leading candidate for the next elections, which everyone knows has been funded by organized crime. He was a candidate the last time for 4 years at a campaign, and he will be a candidate for the next time, which means he has been campaigning for 4 more years. Who can campaign for 8 years constantly without a job, because he dedicates his time full time, with enormous amount of publicity from billboards painted on the roadsides to huge ads in the newspapers or television? The expense of 8 years of campaign is enormous. That can only be subsidized by illicit funds. This is very dangerous for a country. We have mayors that have been put in jail because they were discovered to be part of a drug cartel. in some regions, especially the border areas with Mexico, where there's a traffic of drugs by land. So it is a very serious problem, the question of campaign financing. And of course, we don't want to limit campaign financing, and we don't want to tell, or I don't want to tell as a mandate holder, what method the states should have. But I do want to apply the principle of transparency. So what I left really clear in the report is that all funding should be reported. And for me, the best way, and we had this was a debate in all the consultations, should parties be forced to report to the public? Should freedom of information laws be applied to parties? I believe this is legitimate. I believe that political parties are public institutions, like any other institution of the state. They operate in the political public sphere, and they are a vehicle to political power. But I found that that was not practical. It is valid as a principle, but that's not practical. It's not so easy for a journalist or any citizen to walk into a party and say, look, I want to see your books, show me how much money you have received. So it was much better, and this is my recommendation in the report, to have the basic idea that all funding should be reported to the electoral authority, according to the legislation of every country, but it should be a periodic form of reporting. How often, how frequent, every country will have the legislation. But there should be a periodic form of reporting, not only the amounts that were being funded, but the sources of the funds. Where are these funds coming from? And once they're in the hands of the electoral authority, they should become accessible to the broad public, as public information in the hands of the state. And there's no reason why that, and this for me seemed to be the most practical method of doing it. Now, one of the other recommendations is that not all support for campaigns comes in cash, comes in monetary form. Some donations, and this again I'm using the example of my own country, are done in kind, in space of television, in time and radio. And this becomes very important. So again, when you have massive accumulation of media and huge consortiums of the world, a Rupert Murdoch, for instance, where you have this sort of concentration of different forms of media, then it is very easy to begin negotiating with who are going to be the next parliament, the next legislators, and begin striking deals. In my country, for instance, we just had the example, Congress passed by national emergency with only one vote the new telecommunications law, in which it prolonged the concession of frequencies from 15 to 25 years for free, with no cost at all. And just that can be renovated just with an exchange of letters between the concessionaries and the state. Now it turns out that the concessionaries is one person who owns all 4 channels of television. So obviously, and by the way, it had huge majority in Parliament. Why? Because this man very intelligently gives free space to all parties, not only to one. But he does it in the form of negotiation. Everyone writes sort of a certain commitment with him, and he has documents to back that up. So obviously, this is as undemocratic as an electoral process can be. So this was very important. I said the transparency of all forms of donation, whether it be in monetary form or whether it be in kind through space in any form of media. It can be written media, it can be telecommunications and all that. One of the comments, the only comment that I got is that there was not enough on internet, and this is true. I didn't deal, although I've written so much about internet and the freedom of the net, for 2 reasons. One is because, like I said, 80% of the information that people use for electoral processes comes from television today. I think it's a generational question. I think the next generation will probably change that. But in this moment, this is the reality. But secondly, because an internet is very difficult to regulate. Anyone can use internet for free, and anyone can promote a tweet. And one of the biggest problems is that initially many of the comments and tweets were coming from one individual, but now what used to be the call centers and making phone calls to a radio station now are the tweet centers, where you can have 100 people working for you, sending millions of tweets a day, giving the impression that you have many people commenting, and it's not real. No? So this is a problem that we'll have to deal with and let technology evolve and see. Not that we can limit it, because again, it is a form of free expression, and I will not limit the internet in any way, but that there should be some form of the public to be informed about that. And in the case of information, I finally deal with the polling institutions. I believe that polling is done all the time and should be done all the time. But in electoral periods, there should be again, an element of information of the methodology of the polling agency to give some credibility. So again, polling agencies should notify the electoral authority what the methodology, what type of a sample of individuals they have. Not that they should identify the individuals themselves, there's an element of privacy there, but that they should identify the type of sample of population that they're dealing with and the methodology that they were using for polling. Because this can actually allow the population to try to verify the credibility of polling. And many countries have sort of what they call a polling curfew, which is in order not to affect the elections at the last moment, because a immediate poll right before the elections can have a determinant factor for undecided population. Some countries have a 24-hour prohibition of publication. You can make the polls, but you cannot publish the results. And some countries have 3 days, up to, like Mexico has 72 hours, but many countries, most of the countries have at least 24 hours of non-publicity. Now, in the consultation in Spain, and I remember this very clearly, the example, a friend from Spain was saying, yes, we have a prohibition as well, but what happens in our country, and this is that you will have a poll and then they will publish it in the electoral newspaper of Andorra, which is not, it is not technically, it's not Spain, but it's right there, and everyone looks at the electronic newspaper of Andorra, you know, so, but I didn't have a solution for that. I mean, the Andorra newspaper was commenting about the elections in Spain and said, and we discovered that. But my hope is that not very many people are accessing through internet the newspaper of Andorra. But anyway, there will always be a way to circumvent. But I think these measures of no polling results, I would actually encourage states to have 3 days, because I think it's important to have a time to verify the polls, and the people can confront the methodology and see if they're valid. And the second type of polling is the exit polls. And that again is a danger, because if you are publishing the day of the election, for instance, you publish the exit poll at noon of how the vote is going 4 hours after the polling booths were open, that you were open at 8 and at 12 you make a publication, you can mark the elections, because people all of a sudden can see that so-and-so is winning the elections by a big margin. But that's not real, because voting has to deal with this type of schedule every family has, the distance from the polling booth, how close you are, how far you are, or if it's on a working day, what schedule do you have of working or not. So the idea is that yes, there could be exit polls, and they can be published, but never before the last voting booth was closed. So during the day of elections, they could never affect the result of those elections. I mean, the result of the elections have to be a very thorough process of reflection of the population with a huge amount of information about their candidates. It can't be a last-minute poll that will push opinion to one side or the other. These were very basic recommendations on the question of information being gathered and being pushed. There was another series of smaller things, but those were probably the most important. But I believe, then there was something about the strength. All this means that there should be strong electoral authorities, that there should be a strong education process, education for democracy, citizenship process, that elections are not determined just by the electoral period, and some countries are 3 months, some countries are 2 months, or some countries are longer, but elections should be determined by the maturity of the population, how they can sort of develop their own ideas, their own thoughts, their own sympathies, their process. So there should be a permanent electoral process in motion from the state to all, especially, for instance, with children in schools, with the population in general, using media, but using media as an educational tool. And this would be very relevant. This was the end of my report. Probably the most important aspect, I think the most dramatic aspect of it is It's one thing I forgot. The transparency has one added element, which is, no one questioned it, by the way, in my presentation of my report, but I know that in my country this is becoming one of the most questionable things, is that the transparency should include the transparency of ownership of media. In order for the population, and this is a discussion I know that the European Commission is having, and the Council of Europe as well in Strasbourg was also having. They were trying to draft some guidelines, because for people to interpret the position that's presented by media, it's important to know who the owners are, because that way they know what the origin of that thought is. Not to condition content, not to get involved in the content, it's just to know who the owners up to the last personal name. As a matter of fact, I discovered that in Europe the debate is going further. I wouldn't go that far, I didn't put it that far, but the debate is going further to the extent that in some positions in Europe have it that there should be a disclosure of who are the biggest advertisement interests. Like anyone who has more than 10% of the income of a media by advertising also has a controlling interest, even if they're not owners. But they are so powerful in the economic influence to that media that even that should be identified by media. I would not put that just for practical. I think it's going far in the sense that you may have someone announcing that represents more than 10% of the income of the media, but for 1 month or in the next month they don't have it, or it becomes very, very cumbersome. But I think the ownership of the media is a legitimate question of disclosure. It's not a matter, it's not a breach of privacy. You're not asking them to reveal anything about themselves except their identity. And there is no reason why media, being a public element of knowledge and of information, should have secret owners. There's no reason to guarantee secrecy there. In terms of the paid publicity, and this was probably again the most controversial part, and some people criticize me of not being stronger than that, but that's more difficult. I presented the 3 models that there's countries that are deregulating to almost have no limitations, like the US. The Supreme Court is deregulating even the limits to personal contributions, which I think is very fragile. And there's countries like in Europe especially, where no paid publicity is allowed. Because the idea is that the public should be informed through the news media, the news coverage, and not through paid ads. And they were telling me the example in Britain, for instance, there was an environmental NGO that wanted to publish an ad against a candidate because he was in favor of urban development that would topple a forest in some areas. And even that was forbidden. Because although it was an environmental paid ad from an NGO, not even a political party, it was taking a position on elections. So it was saying, don't vote for this candidate because we'll lose our forest. So and it was during the electoral period. So the electoral authorities said, no, you can publish that before the electoral period or after, but not during the electoral period because we don't want paid publicity to mark the vote. I believe in principle. I think it is not money, it's not paid publicity that should determine the sympathies of the population for any party or candidate. Now, this is very controversial. So there's a third model, which is the one that Mexico just applied in their new legislation. It's very much around the world, but it's to give paid publicity to the electoral authority. Some people say it's difficult to guarantee our objective, but in Mexico they have a fund where 70% of the fund will be allocated in proportion to the vote of the past elections. And 30% of the fund will be allocated in equal parts to all participants. That would include even new parties and that would come into these elections, for instance. I think that's still open to debate, but I present the 3 models and at least I established the principle that it would be good countries consider under legislation the fact that it should not be the monetary element, the funding, that would determine the vote by a higher amount of paid publicity, but it would be more to enhance the diversity and plurality of the media and the news coverage so everyone has an opportunity to be covered by the press. This is what is in my report. And by the way, just for information, many of the people that are here with me today and our Institute demos from Guatemala, we're doing a consultation as well today on the next report, which is going to be Children and Freedom of Expression. I think that, again, we were trying to build into the future of what will become. I know that even the Human Rights, the Children's Rights Committee or Committee on the Rights of the Child is looking at communication with children as part of their right to participation of children. And this for us is very important because that's another issue that I've said from the beginning, is the freedom of expression is something that you learn. Not only a right that you have, which is true, we have a right, but you learn how to use it. And that means you learn by using it from the earliest ages. And what are the conditions, and especially when we're dealing with the new technologies, with internet or mobile phones, there is an element of prevention and protection of children that is important to take into account. So that will be hopefully a next report, which I will try to draft, but will be presented by my successor to the General Assembly. Thank you very much.